Um, just to say something about Mrs. Thatcher in the context of this class, because the last lecture will address her legacies specifically. But she was elected in 1979, and that date is often taken to mark the end of the system of social democracy that I've been talking to you about, that was established in the aftermath of the Second World War, and the displacement of social democracy with what became known as Thatcherism, or later was known as neoliberalism. As I think both the Specials song in 1981 and Kinnock's speech in 1983 indicates, it actually takes a considerably longer period of time for the Thatcher project to gel. And it's important to emphasize at this point, when even the New York Times is engaged in valedictory obituaries of her, that her influence and her effect were deeply contentious in Britain, and remain so to these days, even though she's going to get a state funeral. So today's lecture is not about Margaret Thatcher. It is about basically the place of Britain's role in the world, and particularly the collapse of the British Empire, and where that story fits into an account of the development of social democracy, the formation and development of social democracy in the decades of the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And very often, this image that you see before you, which is of the botched British invasion of the Suez Canal in 1956, is taken as the critical turning point in the story, not just of the collapse of British imperial influence in the world, but of its broader influence and role in the world. But what I'm going to try and do today is to say it's a little more complicated than that. And I'm going to talk to you about a series of different but related processes, such as the displacement of Britain by the United States as the world superpower, the end of Britain's imperial influence that begins to accelerate following the independence of India and the partition of Pakistan in 1947, and the creation of Britain as a multiracial and multi-faith society that came as a consequence of that process of decolonization. And then finally to look at Britain's relationship with Europe and the project of European integration more broadly. So let me begin by reminding you that in 1945, Britain was still a world superpower. And it was, of course, one of the big three nations represented at the Potsdam Conference in 1945. It got and continues to have a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council. And this prestige and visibility of Britain was in many ways a consequence of its perceived strength, given its central role in the defeat of Germany and its allies during the Second World War, but also the continuing power and reach of an empire that was, even after the independence of India in 1947, still covering a fifth of the world's territory. Indeed, in 1953, when Hillary and Tenzing conquer Mount Everest, as you see celebrated in the Illustrated London News here. This was seen as, in many ways, a good illustration of the great commanding power of the British people and the British Empire, still engaged on manly conquering adventures. There's no question that Britain's prestige in the post-war global settlements was bolstered by its empire. And Britain continued to see itself as a bulwark between the US and the Soviet Union in the developing Cold War. Britain thought that its empire would give it a particular role to play as a counterpoint between this developing bipolar world. But as we'll see, what happens is that Britain increasingly becomes a client rather than simply an ally of the United States. And in important ways, that was a consequence of the financial ruin of the two world wars that Britain had fought in the space of 20 years. And the fact that, despite expectations, the British Empire did not come to rescue the country economically. Indeed, Britain became dependent upon US loans and dollars, and America used its financial and military power to help bolster the British Empire to counter the threats of the spread of communism in Southeast Asia and the continent of Africa. In other words, we have to understand the process of decolonization of the British Empire in the context of the broader Cold War. We also have to understand that collapse of the British Empire on its own terms. And certainly the Second World War made it quite apparent that the British Empire was no longer invincible. In 1942, the fall of Singapore at the hands of Japanese troops was considered to be a crushing military blow and blow to the prestige of Britain's imperial army. And of course, the spread of colonial nationalism during and after the war, which culminated with independence, as I said, in India in 1947, but a whole series of other growing revolts against British rule in Southeast Asia and in Africa, as we'll see. All of these things made the maintenance of the British Empire increasingly expensive, especially given that the Indian Army had long played an absolutely critical strategic role in the military defense of the British Empire. So decolonization accelerates in the 1950s, and basically as that process takes hold, British horizons begin to be redirected towards European integration, again with American encouragement as their key ally in this developing European project. Now, the other key element of this class, as I've already said, is the way in which colonial migration through this process of decolonization creates a new type of multiracial, multi-faith society in Britain. Now, that, in important ways, as we'll see, changes Britain's understanding of itself as a nation, transforms Britain's sense of its own national identity, but it also, I think, has a key role in the unraveling of social democracy itself in ways that I hope will become apparent by the end of the lecture. So let me talk first about Britain and its relationship with the good old US of A. In many ways, this story, I think, has to start in 1941. 1941 is a critical turning point in relations between Britain and America. It's, in a way, as I say here, the change of guard on the global stage between Britain and the US, because it's at this point that Britain's financial and military dependence upon the US becomes first apparent. Keynes described this as an absolutely transformative moment in which America was picking out the eyes of the British Empire. So even at the time, influential people like Keynes were aware of the deeply important nature of this moment. And it happened in three phases. It happened first in March with the signing of the Lend-Lease Agreement, which I've already talked to you about. It happened in August, as you see here, off the coast of Newfoundland in Canada, when Churchill and Roosevelt meet on the HMS Prince of Wales and sign the Atlantic Charter. An Atlantic Charter which cements the political alliance between Britain and America, but also is seen to, in some ways, constrain Churchill's hand. It commits Britain to a shared vision of freedom from want and of fear, and it also establishes the illegitimacy of the importance of independent sovereignty of nations, i.e., it is implicitly critical of the British Empire. Then finally, in December of 1941, a really important moment is the arrival of US troops on British soil, in order, obviously, to aid the Allied war effort against Germany and its allies, but for whom some people felt was the beginning of a type of military occupation. It's a moment when British sovereignty seems to be called into question. So if 1941 is a key moment, it accelerates in the aftermath of the war with the continuing and deepening necessity or reliance of Britain upon American financial muscle. As I've already said, Britain has war debts of £22 billion in 1945. It loses a whole bunch of overseas investments during the war. It loses 2/3 of its exports, and it struggles with this enormous balance of payments deficit. So Keynes is again dispatched off to Washington in 1945 to beg loans from the American Treasury of £3.75 billion pounds to try and make the pound convertible at $4 under the Bretton Woods system. In other words, to try and maintain the value of the pound as it had been in the so-called golden era of the gold standard before the First World War and briefly again in the 1920s. There's then a second round of loans that develop in 1947 through the Marshall Plan, and then a third round of loans in 1950 when America loans Britain a further £145 million and a line of credit of 930 million. So Britain is basically the point that I'm trying to get here, and I've given you all of those figures before, I think, that Britain is financially increasingly structurally dependent on America. The other growing form of dependence of Britain on America was militarily. Now, Britain tried very hard in the post-war period to maintain its global role through its own defense expenditure. Indeed, one historian has recently argued that the post-war period should be better understood not as a welfare state system, but as a warfare state system. Defense expenditure, as you can see, grows, doubles from 2.6 to 5.8% of GDP in the 1940s and in the 1950s. And that growth is in many ways about the cost of maintaining the military capacities and military control of the British Empire. Because without that, Britain would lose a considerable amount of its global influence. The other key element of this growing expenditure on the defence industries was, of course, the cost of the development of Britain's independent nuclear capacity, which, as you can see in this image, was tested on British colonial territories like Australia and several of the Pacific Islands as well. The independent nuclear capacity was meant to give Britain the type of military leverage that and strategic role that the loss of the Indian Army had once played. Britain's military alliance with the US, of course, becomes cemented with the formation of NATO in 1949. But all that does is formalize a relationship that had already been well established, because after American troops arrived in Britain, the next thing that happened was American air bases were established in the UK in 1942, and those air bases are further developed in the post-war period, with two new bases at Lakenheath and Mildenhall in the 1950s, and of course also the base at Aldermaston, which becomes a site of protest against by the people campaigning against the nuclear deterrent. Now, there's different dates for the time in which American nuclear missiles are sighted in Britain, but basically it happens some point in the middle of the 1950s. Effectively, it happens in 1954. The formal agreement is actually signed in 1958. So here is, for many people, again, a key way in which the loss of sovereignty that Britain had by the sighting of military troops during the Second World War was now cemented and expanded in the post-war period. Imagine for a moment the idea that Canada or Mexico could sight their own troops and air stations on the territory of the United States. It's a considerable deviation from the idea of national sovereignty. Now, the other key moment here is, of course, the Suez Crisis in 1956. It's pretty clear that America is supporting Britain financially and militarily because the British Empire is still strategically important for the US in the conduct of the Cold War. What becomes clear in 1956 is that America is basically calling the shots. And so the great contrast is between the American support of the British counter-insurgency techniques in Malaya, where it's trying to put down a nationalist revolt in which communists are playing a role, and therefore is a key bridgehead for the US to try and keep communism out of Southeast Asia, and Egypt. In 1952 in Egypt, Nasser, the nationalist leader, replaces King Farouk, who is basically a client of Britain. Remember, Egypt had been part of the British Empire since 1882 and through to the 1920s. In 1954, Nasser orders the withdrawal of British troops from Egyptian soil, and in 1956, in part as retaliation, Britain and the US cancel a big dam contract for the construction of a dam project in Egypt. And in response, Nasser takes control of the Suez Canal, which had long been the strategic strategically hugely important for British trade and shipping to have access to the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Anthony Eden, the leader of the Conservative Party, collaborates with France, which of course also had imperial interests in Egypt, to try and reopen the canal, to try and basically recolonize the canal. And America withdraws its support for that offer, for that effort. And Britain and France are left basically high and dry and have to withdraw in defeat. It's a major humiliation for Britain. Anthony Eden resigns from office and is succeeded immediately by a new Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan. Now, all of this meant that there was a growing political anti-Americanism developing in Britain. We've seen already in the 1920s and the 1930s a growing suspicion, distrust, and dislike of American mass culture. What we see happening in the 1950s is a sharpening of that anti-American critique and its expression in new political forms. And there are really two examples of that. The first is the Keep Left group, which was a group within the Labour Party headed by Michael Foot and Crossman that wanted Britain to maintain a non-aligned position, i.e. to break free of its relationship with the United States. The other key organisation was the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, which was campaigning not just against the removal of American missiles from nuclear missiles from British soil, but the removal of the abandonment of Britain's nuclear deterrent. But it provided a key outlet for people's criticisms of the sighting of American military of nuclear missiles on British soil, a debate that continued for decades. Okay, let me move on to the complicated process of decolonization. Now, people often speak of various phases of the British Empire. The first British Empire is often thought to run up to the War of Independence in 1776. The Second British Empire, therefore, is the moment when British imperialism reorientates itself to Asia and becomes orientated around the idea of an empire of trade. The Third British Empire, which is a term that some historians use to talk about the recalibration of the British imperial mission at some point after the First World War. And people would argue about whether it begins after 1918 and 1919 with the mandates, or whether we can think of it as beginning after 1945. Doesn't seem to me to be so important when it is that you choose a starting date, than you realize that it distinguishes a different type of character of British imperialism, and that's really what it's trying to get at. And I'm going to suggest to you that there are basically three elements to this new character of British imperialism in this period: political, cultural, and economic. So the political project first. After the Second World War, the British Empire is rebranded as a Commonwealth of Nations. A Commonwealth of Nations that can include formal colonies and colonies that have gained independence, either as dominions or as their own republics. But the story of the development of the idea of a Commonwealth of Nations begins much earlier. It begins, in fact, in the 1890s, when people begin to argue for the idea of a Greater Britain of the white settler colonies that became dominions shortly afterwards. There were imperial conferences that were part of the development of this idea, in which the South African leader, Jan Christian Smuts, first coined the term, this Commonwealth of Nations, in 1917. And this idea of the Commonwealth we see also threaded through the Statute of Westminster in 1931 that I talked to you about several weeks ago. The idea here was that the dominions, the so-called white dominions of Australia and New Zealand and South Africa and even Ireland after 1922, would get, in return for their continuing political relationship with Britain, or in return for their independence, I should say, closer economic and cultural ties with the so-called motherland. So let me look at what those cultural and economic ties were. A key part of this effort was the idea of being able to maintain a British world, an Anglo world of influence. And culture was seen to be an important part of that project. The idea was to spread British influence culturally through the dissemination of films and books and plays and radio broadcasts and so forth. In many ways, we can see the beginning of this process with the formation of the Empire Press Union in 1909, the Empire Press Union, which was established to facilitate the exchange of news between across the British Empire. But we've also seen it in the creation of the Empire Marketing Board in 1926, and then the Colonial Film Unit in 1939. But I think really the two most critical organisations that you should focus on are the British Empire, the BBC Empire Service, which we now know as the BBC World Service, and the formation, which was formed in 1932, and the British Council, which is formed in 1934. Now, the British Empire Service gets renamed in 1939 the Overseas Service, and it quickly begins to focus upon the broadcasting in foreign languages, the promotion of British news in indigenous languages. By 1945, it was broadcasting in Arabic, in Afrikaans, in Bengali, in Gujarati, in Marathi, in Hindi, in Tamil, in Persian, in Thai, in Malay, in Mandarin and Cantonese, as well as Japanese. Okay, this was a major projection of British cultural influence across the world. It also broadcast in all European languages. So this wasn't simply about trying to maintain British influence in the colonial world. It was a globally conceived project. The other area that I think is really new and important was the growing economic ties, or the restructuring of the economic ties of the British Empire project. And I've talked to you already about the creation of the sterling area in 1931 when Britain comes off the gold standard. But what I really want to, and that continues all the way through to the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1972. The sterling area is operating, as we know, because I've already talked about the devaluation of the pound through it, all the way through to 1972. The other key area was the passage of a series of colonial development and welfare acts in 1949, 1950, and 1959. These acts were basically first designed to try and rescue the ailing British economy, to try and develop colonial economies in ways that would make them satellites of the British economy, provide them raw materials and provide them new markets for Britain's failing export industries. But the welfare component of these development acts, which was new in 1949, was also a gesture to the fact that the empire would also, that colonies would also have access to some of the forms of welfare that were being championed in the social democratic system in Britain. Now, in no way did they receive anything like the welfare services that British citizens had, but it was a gesture to the fact that colonial government was now newly orientated around the welfare of colonial subjects. It was therefore, in part, a deliberate attempt to defuse growing nationalist unrest and labour unrest across the British Empire, particularly in the Caribbean and in East and West Africa. Now, so far I've just been talking to you about the attempt to strengthen the British Empire, to make the British Empire endure in new types of ways. I also have to account for the way in which the British Empire falls apart. And one of the great mythologies that British historians have long had about the process of decolonisation was, because we always like to contrast ourselves to the French, that whereas decolonisation for France was a bloody and protracted affair, in Britain it was peaceable and pragmatic. That at a certain point, imperial administrators just decided to lower the flag and gracefully exit the country, having fostered the independence of new nation states. This is a complete sham. But this process begins in 1947 and 1948 with a relatively peaceable withdrawal from India, Pakistan, Burma, Ceylon and Palestine. I say relatively peaceful because clearly the partition of India and Pakistan was a violent and a mess, which displaced hundreds and thousands of people. The real issue was how could the British Empire maintain itself militarily? And here we see that in the 1950s, the same techniques of military repression that the British Empire had developed for over a century was used in earnest to try and cling on to certain imperial territories. There was violent repression against anti-colonial struggles in the 1950s in Ghana, in Malaya, in Kenya, and in the Suez Crisis in Egypt. I'm going to focus just on the Kenyan case, because I can't possibly cover all of those different places. The Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya basically lasted between 1952 and 1956. It was brutally suppressed by the British colonial government that built concentration camps, which you'll remember had first been pioneered during the South African War of 1899 to 1901. An estimated 160 to 320,000 people were detained in these concentration camps as a way of trying to restrain the so-called guerrilla tactics of the Mau Mau revolt. And in those camps, there was resort to the use of forced labour, to starvation rations, and to the rape of women and girls. Indeed, there's estimated to have been somewhere between 130 and 300,000 deaths in those camps in these years. There was, importantly, a growing reaction against this repression in Kenya. Okay, remember that this critique of the British Empire and of the violent methods of the British Empire had been around for a while. Remember Campbell Bannerman talking about the methods of barbarism in South Africa. What is important here is that there is beginning to be a break in the party political responses to anti-colonial to the suppression of anti-colonial movements. A good example of this is that figures both on the left of the Labour Party and the right of the Conservative Party begin to coalesce. And in the case of Kenya, we have Barbara Castle, a member of the Labour Party, and a character known as Enoch Powell, who I'll come back to later on, both arguing that this was a disgrace. In fact, Enoch Powell said the Tory party must be cured of the British Empire and the pitiful yearning to cling to the relics of a bygone system. Now, he'll put that to very particular use, as you'll see, but the important point is that there are people across both political parties responding negatively to these attempts. There's also the formation of this organisation called the Movement of Colonial Freedom in 1954. And it's a movement that sets itself apart from the official, it's basically people on the left disillusioned with the Labour Party's policy of not supporting movements for independence. The Labour Party, many people felt, people on the left felt, should embrace colonial nationalist and anti-colonial movements. But in fact, they didn't, even when they were in opposition. There were as much as 70 Labour MPs who were part of this, supporters of this organisation, including Barbara Castle and Tony Benn, who you saw do that fabulous swivel in the Labour radio and TV centre in the election campaign. And they all campaigned against the introduction of the 1962 Immigration Act, which I'll return to in a minute. Basically, by the late 1950s, it was apparent that the political support for the maintenance of empire violently had been lost. And in 1960, Harold Macmillan, Anthony Eden's successor, delivers his famous Winds of Change speech in the South African Parliament, saying effectively, well, you can listen to the video because it's on the course website, saying effectively that the winds of change are blowing through the continent of Africa and that independence was just around the corner. And it was. Ghana and Malaya became independent in 1957, Somaliland, Nigeria and Cyprus in 1960, Sierra Leone, the Southern Cameroons and Tanganyika in 1961, Jamaica, Trinidad and Uganda in 1962, Singapore, Zanzibar and Kenya in 1963, Gambia and the Maldives in 1965, Tonga and Fiji in 1970. An amazing pack of cards falling within the space, basically, of a decade. Now, the lowering of the flag, of course, didn't mean that Britain's imperial influence was immediately removed. Indeed, historians would now argue that the economic and cultural ties of the Third British Empire persisted long after the achievement of formal independence. That, in fact, the post-colony doesn't become post until many decades after independence. And indeed, as we still see today in many parts of the world, the consequences of the British Empire and the systems of rule established there have continued to create structurally enormously difficult problems politically for places like, for instance, Zimbabwe. Okay. Are you still with me? A lot to get through today. A lot of the world to range over. Does anyone have any questions so I can just draw my breath before we hurtle through the last part of the lectures? No? You all with me? Fabulous. Okay, so let me now turn the focus to Britain itself and the impact of colonial migration in the wake of decolonisation. Now, when I was a boy, many decades ago, we used to have an understanding that basically Britain was an all-white country until 1947, when two ships arrived from the Caribbean, the SS Orbiter and the Empire Windrush. And that these boatloads of guest workers, effectively, colonial subjects recruited to the British labour market, represented the first arrival of people of colour in Britain. We now know that that was a wrong-headed idea. And I'm not even going to go back into the deep history of slavery and the story of Jews in the 17th and 18th and early 19th century. What I'm going to focus on instead is basically two categories of people. People who work, people who were labourers, and the intellectual leaders of what became anti-colonial movements. Both of which predated by decades this moment of 1947. So, in the 1920s and 1930s, there had been a good amount of official concern with what were known as coloured seamen. Okay? These coloured seamen were basically, I know, I can see the smiles across your face. You've got to focus. This is not have anything to do with flavoured condoms or anything else. Now you've got me going. It's not fair. I need you to see straight faces in front of me. Okay, I've got it. So, yeah, about coloured seamen. These coloured seamen were basically merchant that worked in the merchant shipping industry. Okay, and they came from across and beyond the British Empire. Okay, they came from East Asia, they came from Southeast Asia, they came from the Pacific Islands, they came from West Africa, they came from East Africa, they came from the Middle East. It's a huge variety of different people who basically got work on ships that were headed to Britain and then had layoffs in between their next journey abroad. And in the 1920s, they become categorized as coloured seamen, and the state begins to try and regulate the amount of time that they're in the country. What's important about these groups of people is that in the big port towns like London and Cardiff and Liverpool, you have the development of multi-racial communities and multi-racial relationships in these areas. And this develops in the 1920s and the 1930s. Indeed, in 1933, there's even a League of Coloured Peoples established to protect the civil rights of these people, and particularly to focus on their rights to employment in Britain. This League of Coloured Peoples attracted the support and involvement of figures like the Caribbean writer C.L.R. James and the founder of Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta. The other group of people who had long been present in Britain was, of course, the leader of anti-colonial movements, who often came to Britain to study in British universities, or in the case of Indian leaders, very often to take law exams in Britain. A great example of this is the meeting of the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester in 1945. There had been, I think, the 3rd Pan-African Congress had been held in London in the 1920s. This 5th Pan-African Congress was organised by the Ghanaian nationalist leader Kwame Nkrumah and included Kenyatta and the grand old man of Dubois. And there were 35 delegates from British organisation representing the interests of people of colour in Britain. So a substantive presence before 1947. Nonetheless, it's clearly the case that the numbers of colonial subjects and colonial migrants increased importantly in the decades following the war. In part, this is encouraged by the British government. In 1948, they passed the British Nationality Act, which provides all imperial subjects the rights, full rights as British citizens, with full access to the social democratic welfare state and, of course, equality, the idea of equality before the law. And many of these people were recruited, as was the people on board the Windrush and the Orbiter, recruited to work by the government, either in the National Health Service as auxiliary workers, or by private companies like the London Transport Company. The numbers of colonial migrants, though, was incredibly small. So between 1951 and 1961, I'm going to throw out some figures and I'll repeat them, so don't worry. The Afro-Caribbean population in Britain grew from 16 to 66,000 people, 16 to 66,000. The number of Indians in Britain increased from 110,000 to 275,000. And the number of Pakistanis grew from 11,000 to 119,000. Okay, so still the numbers are incredibly small. We're talking about less than 500,000 people from these three key areas of colonial migration. But what it does do is it begins to shift the racial geography of Britain. No longer are people of colour confined to these neighbourhoods in port towns. Instead, what you have is the development, the following of these colonial migrants to places of industrial labour. So critically in the Midlands, around the engineering factories of Birmingham, Coventry and Leicester, and in the northwest, around the textile industries of Manchester, Bradford, Oldham and Rochdale. What you also have is the acceleration of the formation of new organisations trying to represent the interests of these colonial migrants. So I've given you three examples here. The Indian Workers' Association, established in 1958, the same year that Claudia Jones set up the West Indian Gazette, the newspaper published out of Notting Hill in London, and the Committee Against Racial Discrimination set up in 1961. I don't have time to show you that, so we'll just move on to this. Migration, though, wasn't simply about people of colour or indeed even colonial subjects or former colonial subjects. The labour shortage after the war meant that European migration across Europe, was also encouraged. And it was encouraged through the European Voluntary Worker Scheme, the EVWs. And here we have many people displaced by the experience of the Second World War. Poles were the most numerous, 145,000 of them, but there were also 90,000 people from the Baltic states, as well as, of course, a new wave of migration of people from Ireland. Interestingly, a whole bunch of people from southern Italy, mainly to work in the brick industries in the East Midlands, and a small number of Jews who chose to stay in Britain or were allowed to stay in Britain rather than heading across to the United States. There's a fabulous film whose name I'm forgetting now. Does anyone know what this is? It's a great film about a Jewish and Caribbean family living in London in the 1950s, and how the West Indian family teaches this young Jewish boy to play cricket, and how it is that, you know, him learning to play cricket was the way in which he becomes English, and he's taught how to do that by a Jamaican. Does anyone know the name of that film? It'll come to me by the end of the lecture. It's a wonderful film. It's about 7 years old. The other flow of migration was actually from Britain to the broader so-called British Anglo world. Emigration was actually encouraged by the British government, and indeed numbers of immigrants actually exceeds the numbers of migrants of immigrants through the early 1950s. And this is in large part because of this scheme, the Assisted Passage Scheme, which gave Britons a very cheap deal of transportation out to the so-called white dominions of Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and Rhodesia, South Africa, and Kenya. But the largest numbers of people go to Australia, 140,000 between 1946 and 1951, and just under 50,000 go to New Zealand to become hobbits. Sorry, Sharon. I have two Kiwis in the audience as well, so that was really uncalled for. I do apologise. Anyway. Colonial migration to Britain creates a reaction of the development of white racism in a new organised forms, as well as some pretty traditionally unorganised forms. What it does is catalyse what I'm calling here the white defence of a so-called white British way of life against what people at the time described as coloureds. And you see here, Stop the Coloured Invasion demonstration in Trafalgar Square in 1959. There had been a series of race riots in Britain in the aftermath of the First World War, but they really accelerated in the 1950s. In Nottingham and Notting Hill in 1958, in Middlesbrough in 1961, which is in the northeast, and in Dudley, which is just north of Birmingham, in 1962. All of these riots are basically aimed not just at the idea of a cultural invasion of coloured people, but of the age-old critique of immigrants that they're stealing our houses, they're stealing our jobs, they're stealing our social services, and they're stealing our women. Now, this racism finds expression in new organised political forms. Oswald Mosley, the leader of the British Union of Fascists, is the first person to pick up the pick up the baton. Forms a union movement in 1948 and stands in the by-election in Notting Hill just after the race riots there in 1959. Much more importantly, though, was the receptive home that white racist politics had in the fringes of the Conservative Party. Groups like the Birmingham Immigration Control Association, set up in 1960, begin to exercise a quite powerful role on local constituency elections and politics. And in some areas, you have and Smethwick, which is spelled, you're never going to be able to guess how this is spelled Smethwick. You have the development of of candidates like Peter Griffith and Cyril Osborne up in Birmingham, pioneering a really explicit racist politics, as you can see from this election poster here. If you want a colour for a neighbour, vote Labour. if you already have, I can't read this, if you're already burdened with one, vote Tory. Okay? In part, as a response to this growing white racism, the Conservative government, just as it had in 1904, when the first Aliens Act had been introduced in Britain, remember, in the advance of an election the following year, so in 1962, as an election is looming and the popularity of the Conservative Party is fading, they introduce a Commonwealth Immigration Act, which tries to restrict the numbers of immigrants through the introduction of a voucher scheme for certain key categories of workers. What the 1962 Immigration Act also does, however, is introduce new systems for trying to formalize systems attempting to integrate the so-called coloured communities into British society as a whole. And this is taken in two forms. First, you have the use of the old imperial knowledge of anthropology, of social anthropology, put to work to study so-called coloured communities in Britain. So the Department of Social Anthropology at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland becomes a key site for this type of work. Indeed, the first book had been published in 1947 by Kenneth Little called Negroes in Britain, a study of Cardiff's Tiger Bay that you see represented here in a picture post image from this period. And his students, Michael Banton, publishes The Coloured Quarter in 1955, and then Sheila Patterson, The Dark Strangers in 1963. These works are works by anthropologists trying to find out how it is that different communities defined by race could be assimilated into Anglo-white British culture. They recognized the key differences, they acknowledged the legitimacy of those differences, but they wanted to promote assimilation. The other area was the development of the study of so-called community relations. And a whole series of voluntary organizations had been working to try and provide colonial migrants access to social services, to advocate for them in terms of jobs and housing, etc. But in 1962, the Immigration Act also sets up for the first time a new community relations, an Institute for Community Relations, which is trying to coordinate the activities of these local voluntary bodies. And again, the emphasis there is on trying to find mechanisms for integration. This became accelerated with when the Labour Party is returned to office in 1964. And the Labour Party develops this approach to race relations that basically tries to integrate the idea of immigration and integration. So Roy Hattersley, who was one of the Labour Party figures dealing with this issue, said, without integration, limitation is impossible, and without limitation, integration is impossible. So one of the first things that they do in 1965 is to pass a race relations bill, precisely the type of act that Card had been calling for since the early 1960s, that outlawed discrimination on racial grounds in public places, but didn't make it a criminal offence. It also established a new race relations board in 1966 to try and deal with cases to try and promote better race relations. It wasn't until the Immigration Act of 1968 that racial discrimination in housing, employment, and public service became was made illegal, and it was this act that basically catalyzed the famous speech by Enoch Powell that I'll talk to you about next week, warning that unless immigration was going to be stopped, in this case of East Asian of Asians from Kenya, that the rivers of blood would flow through Britain. And I'll return to that next week. But I have 10 minutes left to talk about European integration. Margaret Thatcher would be hugely proud of me. Okay. So the first thing to do is to correct, I think, the common sense view that you get from reading or listening to the American media about relations between Britain and the European project. Britain has, since the days of Mrs. Thatcher, routinely projected itself as anti-European, as being opposed to European integration, and as trying to defend British sovereignty against that, against the process of political and economic unity. It's for that reason that Britain is one of the few places in Europe that is not that has kept its own currency. But in fact, even Mrs. Thatcher's hero, Winston Churchill, was thought that there was huge potential in a project of European integration, because Churchill believed that the British Empire needed to be bolstered by that he believed that in the developing bipolar world of the Cold War, that the British Empire wasn't going to be enough as a counterpoint to the struggle between the Soviet Union and the United States, and that Europe had to step up to play an intermediary role, that Britain and the British Empire wasn't enough to do that. Nonetheless, European integration is in important ways facilitated by America as part of its Cold War objectives, to try and maintain the stability of Europe so that the Berlin Wall, as it was developing, would be the end point of the forward march of the Soviet Union. So the Marshall Plan was, of course, absolutely central here to the economic reconstruction of Europe in 1948, but so was the formation of the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951, the first pan-European attempt at coordination. And then finally, in 1957, we have the signing of the Treaty of Rome that creates the European Economic Community itself, signed by Belgium, France, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and West Germany. Now, Britain is not part of that list, you will note. And that was because, in large way, despite Churchill's interest in European integration, the British Foreign and Colonial Office saw Britain's world as being still locked in its old imperial spheres of influence. That changed in the late 1950s and early 1960s as the British Empire began to crumble. Britain needed some other platform to exercise an extra-national influence. And it was encouraged to do that by the United States, which wanted Britain to be at the heart of the European project so that it could have its closest European ally involved. And it was encouraged by the grisly reality of British economic fortunes, which the empire had failed to rescue. British export industries basically had not been saved by the Sterling area and by the Colonial Development and Welfare Acts. Indeed, between 1952 and 1965, Britain's GDP per capita was the lowest in Europe. So Britons looked to the continent of Europe and saw the type of economic vitality that many wished to happen in Britain itself. And during that same period of time, trade with Europe rose from 12 to 18%, at the same point as trade with the Commonwealth fell from 45 to 35%. So there was a basic economic reality here as well as a geopolitical shift going on. And this was a move that effectively was agreed to by both political parties. The first application for European to admission under the Treaty of Rome was by the Conservative government in 1963, Harold Macmillan's administration in 1963. Then came the application by Howard Wilson and the Labour Party in 1967, both rejected by the European Community, and finally success in 1972 under the leadership of Edward Heath and the Conservative Party. Okay, any questions before I wrap this this beast of a lecture up? No? Okay. So a few basic points that I want to reiterate. The first is that arguably there's no more transformative period of time in terms of Britain's relationship with the wider world than in the decades of the 1950s and the 1960s, or rather from 1947 through to 1972. I can't think of any other period of time during the course of this, during the chronology of this class, where that transformation was quite so huge. And a key part of this was about Britain being caught between three different geopolitical forces: its own empire, the developing American empire in the Cold War, and the project of European integration. And in a way, we can't understand any of these processes without thinking of the interrelationship of those three components. Nonetheless, even though some of this is about geopolitical strategy and relations, it's also important to emphasize that they had a huge effect on the development of the system of social democracy in the post-war period. And we shouldn't think that it was simply decolonization that played a big role here. And the inseparability of, say, the Colonial Development and Welfare Acts and the Sterling area and colonial migration. Clearly, the empire and social democracy are deeply embedded with each other in many ways. But so too were the key financial and political relations with America and the European project. Nonetheless, what we're beginning to see in this lecture is the agonized emergence of Britain as a multiracial and multi-faith nation. It's at this time that people in Britain begin to live around people of colour for really the first time in any type of significant scale. And this catalyzes a defense of Anglo-whiteness, but it also creates the beginning of the forms that we would come to understand as multiculturalism in the 1970s and the 1980s, which I'll talk to you about in a couple of weeks. The other last point that I want to make here is that it's not just that the migration of colonial subjects in Britain doesn't just lead to a sharper definition and defense of a so-called white way of life. It also puts into sharp relief the very idea of the class system in Britain itself. There's a profound way in which colonial migration leads to a new articulation of what the white working class looked like and the type of way of life it was expected to have. And it's that issue that I will talk to you about on Thursday. Thank you.